Dog howls all night near a cemetery. The police dig and are shocked. The night was eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of rustling leaves carried by the cold wind. The small town of Willow Creek, nestled between rolling hills and thick woods, was used to its share of spooky tales. But this was different. For weeks now, every single night, the mournful howl of a dog pierced through the darkness. Its cries came from the direction of the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. Nobody dared venture there after sunset. The cemetery had long been rumored to be cursed, a place where the dead didn't rest easy. By the third week, the howling had become the talk of the town. "That dog's got to be in trouble," Mrs. Henderson, the owner of the town's diner, would say every morning as she served coffee. "Or maybe it's seen something none of us wants to know about," her husband would mutter, shaking his head. The police dismissed it at first. After all, stray dogs were common in the area. But when locals started complaining of sleepless nights, and a few even claimed to have seen shadowy figures near the cemetery, Officer Mark Taylor decided it was time to investigate. Mark wasn't the superstitious type. He'd been on the force for 10 years and had seen his fair share of strange cases. But something about this felt different. Perhaps it was the look in his neighbor's eyes when she begged him to do something about that poor dog. Or maybe it was the way the howling seemed to cut straight through the night, pulling at something deep and primal within him. Whatever the reason, he found himself heading to the cemetery just after midnight, flashlight in hand, his breath visible in the icy air. As Mark approached, the howling grew louder, more desperate. The cemetery gates creaked ominously as he pushed them open. His flashlight swept across weathered gravestones, their inscriptions barely legible under layers of moss. The dog's cries led him to a far corner of the cemetery, where a large oak tree loomed like a sentinel over the graves. There, standing in a patch of moonlight, was the source of the howling, a scruffy, mud-caked German shepherd with piercing amber eyes. It was pacing back and forth, stopping every so often to paw at the ground near a gravestone. Mark tried calling out to the dog, but it didn't budge. Instead, it let out another heart-wrenching howl, its gaze locked on the disturbed earth beneath its feet. Something was buried there, something the dog was desperate to uncover. Against his better judgment, Mark knelt down and started digging with his hands. The soil was cold and damp, clinging to his fingers like it didn't want to give up its secrets. Just as his fingers brushed against something hard, a deep growl made him freeze. The dog wasn't growling. It was something else. Mark's flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw movement among the gravestones. His heart raced as he pulled out his radio to call for backup, but before he could speak, a chilling whisper seemed to echo around him. Leave. What had Mark just uncovered? And why did the air suddenly feel so heavy, as if the cemetery itself was holding its breath? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. The mystery was far from over. The next morning, Mark couldn't shake the eerie events of the previous night. Back at the station, his colleagues joked about his ghost hunt, but he couldn't laugh for long. He had barely slept, haunted by the growling, the whisper, and the desperate howls of the German shepherd. The soil under his nails and the faint outline of the hard object he'd touched, it all felt too real. By mid-morning, curiosity got the better of him. Mark drove back to the cemetery, this time with a shovel and his partner, Officer Rachel Miller. Rachel was a no-nonsense officer, more skeptical than superstitious. "Probably a raccoon's stash," she joked, as they parked by the cemetery gate. But when they reached the gravestone where Mark had been digging, they found the German shepherd still there. The dog barked at Mark, then pawed at the ground again, as if urging him to continue. Mark knelt down, gently patting the dog's head. Its eyes were intelligent, filled with an intensity that made Mark feel like it was trying to communicate something urgent. "All right, boy," he said. "Let's see what you've been trying to show us." Rachel stood watch, flashlight in hand, while Mark dug deeper. The soil was looser than it should have been, like it had been disturbed recently. After a few minutes, Mark's shovel struck something solid. With a deep breath, he cleared the dirt away, revealing a wooden box, old, weathered, and locked with a rusted latch. "Let's take this back to the station," Rachel suggested, but the dog barked furiously, its growls echoing across the cemetery. It stood between them and the box, as if to say, "Open it now." Mark hesitated before prying the latch open with his shovel. Inside, wrapped in a tattered cloth, were what looked like human bones. The air grew colder, and Rachel instinctively stepped back. "What the?" she whispered. The dog whimpered, nuzzling the bones gently before turning its gaze to Mark, its amber eyes filled with sorrow. Mark's mind raced. Why was this dog so attached to these remains, and why were they buried in an unmarked spot? Back at the station, forensic experts confirmed that the bones belonged to a young woman who had likely been buried within the last 2 decades, but there was no record of a grave in that location, and the cemetery caretaker insisted he hadn't noticed any recent disturbances. Meanwhile, the dog, whom Mark had temporarily named Shadow, refused to leave his side. It followed him to the station, sat patiently during meetings, and even growled protectively when anyone tried to approach the evidence. Shadow seemed to trust Mark completely, as if it knew he was the only one who could solve this mystery. As word spread, an elderly woman named Mrs. Caldwell came forward, claiming she recognized Shadow. "That dog belonged to my neighbor, Anna Whitmore," she explained. "Anna went missing about 10 years ago. They never found her. Poor Shadow never stopped looking." Mark's gut tightened. Was the dog leading them to Anna's grave? Was this what Shadow had been howling about all these years? With renewed determination, Mark and Rachel dug deeper into Anna's case. They unearthed details about her life, a kind-hearted schoolteacher who had no enemies, at least on the surface. But as they pieced together old police reports, they discovered something chilling. Anna had filed a complaint about a stalker just weeks before she disappeared. The suspect had been questioned but never charged, and the case had gone cold. That evening, Mark sat with Shadow in his backyard, the cold night air biting at his skin. "You've been trying to tell us something all this time, haven't you?" he said softly. Shadow tilted his head, then barked once, short and sharp like an affirmation. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by Rachel's call. "We found something, Mark," she said, her voice tense. "In Anna's file, her stalker, he's still living in town." Mark's heart pounded. Could the stalker have been involved in Anna's death? And if so, why had he buried her remains in the cemetery without leaving a trace? But before Mark could process it, Shadow suddenly jumped up, barking furiously at the edge of the yard. A dark figure was moving just beyond the fence. Mark grabbed his flashlight, but by the time he reached the fence, the figure was gone. Someone didn't want this mystery solved, and Mark was beginning to suspect that whoever it was might be watching his every move. The next morning, Mark and Rachel didn't waste any time. They tracked down the man who had once been Anna Whitmore's stalker, a reclusive local named Daniel Hayes. Daniel had a record of minor offenses, but nothing serious enough to warrant prolonged jail time. Still, the mention of his name in Anna's case files was enough to paint him as a person of interest. Mark and Rachel arrived at Daniel's rundown house on the edge of town, Shadow in tow. As soon as they pulled up, Shadow's demeanor changed. The normally calm and collected dog became agitated, growling low in his throat and pacing back and forth. Mark placed a reassuring hand on Shadow's back. "Easy, boy. We'll handle this." The door creaked open as Daniel, a wiry man with a nervous energy, peered out. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "We're here to ask a few questions about Anna Whitmore," Mark said, keeping his tone neutral. The mention of Anna's name made Daniel visibly tense. His eyes darted to Shadow, who was now snarling, and he took a step back. "I don't know anything about her," Daniel stammered. Mark and Rachel weren't buying it. They pressed him further, bringing up the stalking complaint and Anna's sudden disappearance. As the questioning intensified, Daniel's nervousness turned to anger. "I didn't do anything to her," he snapped. "You people just can't let things go." But Shadow's instincts said otherwise. The dog lunged toward Daniel, barking furiously. Mark held him back, but his gut told him Shadow wasn't just acting out, he was pointing to something. "We're going to need a warrant," Rachel whispered to Mark. That evening, armed with a warrant, they searched Daniel's property. Shadow led them straight to the backyard, where he began digging furiously near a dilapidated shed. Mark and Rachel exchanged a glance before joining in. It wasn't long before they uncovered a disturbing find, items that had clearly belonged to Anna, a scarf, a diary, and a locket with her initials. Daniel, who had been watching from the porch, broke down under the pressure. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he cried. "It was an accident. She rejected me and I lost control." The confession sent chills down Mark's spine. Daniel explained how, in a fit of rage, he had killed Anna and buried her near the cemetery, hoping the unmarked grave would never be discovered. But Shadow had other plans. The dog had escaped Daniel's clutches and returned to the spot night after night, howling for help, refusing to let Anna's memory fade into obscurity. But there was one final twist. As forensic teams began exhuming the rest of the site, they uncovered something even more shocking: a second set of remains. These bones belonged to a man older than Anna and buried decades before. The cemetery, it seemed, had more secrets than anyone had imagined. Forensic analysis revealed the second victim had been murdered in a similar fashion, and records showed that Daniel's father had been accused of a similar crime in the 1970s, but was never convicted. It became clear that the violence ran in the family. Shadow's Howls hadn't just uncovered Anna's grave, they had exposed a legacy of hidden crimes. As Daniel was taken away in handcuffs, Shadow sat quietly beside Mark, his work finally done. The dog's loyalty and determination had not only brought justice to his beloved owner, but had also given a voice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. But Mark couldn't shake one lingering thought. If Shadow hadn't led them to the cemetery, how many more secrets would have remained buried forever? The town of Willow Creek buzzed with the shocking revelations for days. Anna Whitmore's case, once a cold file gathering dust, was finally closed, and justice had been served. But the truth went deeper than anyone had anticipated, uncovering a sinister family history of violence. As the news spread, Shadow became something of a local hero. The cemetery, once feared and avoided, turned into a place of quiet remembrance. Locals brought flowers to Anna's grave, newly marked with her name and dates. Beside her, another grave was created to honor the unidentified second victim, whose story might never be fully known but would no longer be forgotten. For Mark, the case left a profound impact. Shadow had shown him something he'd never seen in all his years as an officer. A loyalty so fierce, it transcended fear and time. The dog had defied every odd, staying true to Anna even when the world had moved on. One sunny morning, Mark stood by the cemetery with Shadow sitting faithfully by his side. "You've done your job, boy," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "Anna can rest now, so can you." But Shadow didn't seem ready to part ways. He wagged his tail and nudged Mark's hand as if to say, "I'm not going anywhere." Moved by the bond they'd formed, Mark made the decision to adopt Shadow. The once lonely dog now had a warm home, a soft bed, and a new purpose. He became Mark's unofficial partner, accompanying him on patrols and earning the affection of everyone in town. One day, as Mark and Shadow strolled through the cemetery, Mark noticed a small group of children gathered near Anna's grave. They placed flowers and whispered stories they'd heard about the brave dog who howled until justice was served. Shadow trotted over, gently wagging his tail, and lay down near the gravestone as if paying his respects. Mark smiled, his heart full. The case had been harrowing, but it had also been a testament to the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Shadow had reminded him and the entire town that loyalty and love could shine even in the darkest places. As the golden light of the setting sun bathed the cemetery, Mark scratched behind Shadow's ears and said, "You're a good boy, Shadow. The best." And for the first time in weeks, the cemetery was silent, peaceful. The howling had stopped, but the memory of Shadow's bravery would echo through Willow Creek forever. What did you think of Shadow's unwavering loyalty? Do you believe animals can sense things we can't? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of incredible bonds and mysteries solved.